Greetings and welcome to today's painting session. Today we are going to work on this beautiful sunset pond scene, something truly serene, really gets you in that feeling of summer. And we're going to begin here today in the sky. I will be using a 1-inch flat-headed brush. I will be dipping the bottom third of it into a little bit of water. This is just going to help keep the paint wet for longer, help with our blending processes. That said, also, if you'd like help with the drawing process, you can find the traceable up over on Patreon, and you can also get the ad-free version of this video up there as well. With that, we are going to jump into this today with a Phthalo blue. It's a nice cool blue. You could also use a cerulean or a Persian blue. I'm going to grab a little bit of Mars black, good amount of titanium white. We're going to mix up a nice grayed version of this for our sky. We want it to be relatively bright despite that it's a cloudy scene, and as you can see, I'm mixing a lot of it because we have a pretty big sky in this painting. So once I get it fairly consistent, we're going to head on over to the canvas and start applying this bright, fairly airy blue into the larger opening, but then I'm also going to extend it over into our clouds just a little bit. That way we can layer our clouds on top of it. We can get that nice transparency. It'll make the clouds feel a lot more alive. And we also have a couple of openings in our clouds right down here, which I'll just tap in with the corner of the brush. It allows me to be a bit more detailed. And just like that, we're off to a nice easy start. Next, we're going to make it nice and dimensional by making a brighter blue white variant of this. I'm just grabbing more titanium white, interjecting that into our mix, and then I'm going to apply that to the bottom here, and we'll slowly work our way up. Initially, it might look a little bit streaky, but if you relieve pressure on your brush and you go into the soft application, it should look pretty nice. And we are going to interject that mix down into here as well. Typically with acrylics, the more layers you apply, the better it looks. So feel free to do this a couple of times. From there, we'll take a step back, and while it's still a little bit wet, we're going to try to do some wet into wet mixing. I'm going to render a purple. At least I'm going to start doing so by working some cadmium red into our blue. We'll grab a good amount of that titanium white, and we'll start with a nice bright purple, something that's very much akin to the values that we have over here, but just a little bit darker. I'm going to apply that in the top right hand corner, and then I'm going to start blending it with an X-shaped pattern into our blue. Should be nice and soft initially. Just like that. And then I'll start to create a bit more form towards the bottom here. And we'll do a soft blend. That said, to get a nice cloud texture, we're actually going to switch to a filbert brush. This has nice round edges, and this gives us soft blends. It's also a great size for rendering clouds of this size. And I'm just going to go in to that already still wet paint. I'm just going to do these little taps and drags. It's going to make our clouds have a bit more of that soft, airy look. Gives it some good dimension. And you can see just so quickly that it adds a lot. We can also switch back and forth between the purples and the blues. We definitely need a lot more down there, and I think I want it to be a little bit darker. So more cad red, more of our blue. Emphasis on the red in this mix, because the lower we get, the more we're going to want to turn it into a red mix, so we can eventually transition it into a bit more of an orange mix. So I'll put this along the sides, put it towards the bottom, work it across there, and then we go back in for soft blends. Again, to avoid a streaky look, we just avoid less pressure with our brush. And we'll get there. Now I'll switch back over to the filbert for the detailed blends. There we go. You can work that down. And this is just a soft base layer. We'll get a lot more detailed with it fairly soon. But it's a great start. And the more we work it, the more we blend it. It's up to you whether how much brush strokes and detail you want in this section, but right now I want it fairly soft with just enough brush stroke to still feel like it has movement and volume. Now I do want to go back to the brighter purple, and I want to start working in additional areas of cloud up here. We have this opening so we can have separation, but I want the line of clouds to be a bit more unique. So I do all of these little pitter patters for a wider look, and then we soften them, leaving openings. So all of the middles of these pitter patters are a bit more opaque, they're less worked, but then the edges are worked a lot, and they get softer and softer until they dissipate into the rest of the sky. It's one of those practices that takes a little bit of patience, and I'm trying to be fairly randomized with it. If you find that your base layer is starting to dry, and I can tell that mine is, you can add a little bit more water to your brush, and that'll extend that wet life, help you with that blending process. But you can also paint wet into dry with just more water. So it doesn't have to still be wet in the base layer. It's not something you have to worry about. It just makes things a little bit easier. And we will transition into the darker purple, especially as we get towards the bottom. Just like that. See, already rendering a lot of detail and depth. It's a pretty short period of time. And now we're doing some extra clouds up top here. I can just see a couple in my reference photo. I'll kind of scrape this in as it is now pretty much dry, but my brush is wet, so I can still get those soft edges with the filbert brush. The roundness of the corners really helps in these more fluffy, airy sections. And airy is a word you'll hear me say a lot in this sky, because that's really the goal. Then we just have this nice opening. Started with a lot of blue, ended up with a lot of purple, but we are going to make it much more complex, especially as we move into the sunset. Now, for this next part, you're really going to want to clean your brush, because we're going to start mixing with our cadmium yellow deep hue, and we don't want this mixing with our blue, or we'll end up with a green in the sky, which is not what we want. We want a warmer hue. So I'm going to grab some of my cad yellow, I'm going to grab some of my cad red, mix up a nice fiery orange over here, but it's a lot too saturated, so we're going to bring this down a bit with our Mars black and our titanium white, just like so. And now we have something warm and red heavy. We want our orange to be more red than it is yellow, especially as we transition through purple, and then we can get more yellow as we work down. But I'm going to start applying this right below, and I'm going to do it in a line before I really connect with the purple, and then I'm going to work in that X-shaped pattern and bring them into one another. And the reason I don't do it over here and then work my way this way is because I didn't want to accidentally pick up a lot of purple and then bring it down into the red over here. So we're just doing it in stages. And we'll softly blend it up. If the purple is still wet, it's great. If it's not, we can do a wet into dry, but we can also go back and grab some of our previous purples, reapply those, and blend them, mix them into our orange. So you have a couple of options depending upon what you're comfortable with. Now we're going to get a little bit closer. We're switching back to the filbert, and we're going to grab more of that purple. I want it to be more detail oriented than what I can accomplish with the larger flat-headed brush, and I want those soft blends. So we're bringing those oranges up, but we're doing so in a very staggered manner, like so. Grabbing more titanium white, working that into the darker purple. And I think that's turning into a great transitionary color. Yet again, I'm working my way across the top line before I do the real blends down into the orange so that I don't muddy the pigments or bring light values into areas where we have dark values into the areas of light values. We're being a bit more intentional with it. But then once we have done so, again, we grab that pigment and we start working it down. And as you can see, it's a much warmer purple at this point. That's now transitioning. I like that. This area, it's kind of nice. We have this hint of the blue of the sky showing through, and we can even re-interject hints of this if you happen to lose them and you still want more. So I'm just going in with little taps initially, but we will blend it out. I apply it, I let it dry just a little bit, and then I go back to the edges and I blend those. That's going to give us something with a nice opaque midsection, but fairly soft edging. And I'll go back and re-interject those highlights into the middle a couple of times, especially if I move them around in the blend. That's really pretty though. I like that a lot. So we continue to move down. We go back to our orange. My brush doesn't have any yellow on it, so I'm not too worried, but that is something to be mindful of. Here we have our orange. We'll blend it up into the purple. We'll go back to the purple. We'll blend it down into the orange, and we just go back and forth with this for a little while. We have some really complex colors happening in the sky right now. Could have gone with a much more simple sky. It's a pond, it's not anything too elaborate, but I think this sky will really build a unique atmosphere and something that makes the piece special. So we're putting the extra time in. We're doing something a bit more complex, but I think it'll really pay off for us in the end. So stepping back, and we should step back regularly, that way we get to see the piece as a whole rather than hyper-focusing on the details. But when stepping back, I think we can see almost a hard division line between this orangey purple and then the orange down here. That's because that's quite opaque, where this is semi-transparent. We have the white of the canvas showing through, so I need to do a lot more with the layering there. And again, I still have the filbert brush. It's going to take a lot longer because it's a smaller brush, but I do like that control, especially through this section. I'm also still interjecting just a hint of Mars Black, but really not much. We'll work that down here, as you can see. We'll let it get a little bit more yellow as we breach the bottom. But this isn't our final color, it's more of a base layer. There we go. That's a beautiful orange for the horizon. That's what we were working towards. Then we'll blend this up. And we'll start reworking on the transitional space. So that's a purple constructed of the Cad red, our blue, titanium white, Mars black to desaturate, but as we get closer to the horizon, it can be a little bit more saturated. We're closer to the sun, we get more intense colors. So we're building our saturation by using less titanium white, less Mars black, and we're finding a nice balance. That said, that is definitely too dark, so more titanium white. Every application won't always be perfect, and that's okay. Let's double down on the red in this mix. There we go. That's a nice transition into that warm base for now. Now we'll go back up to the top. Lots of trial and error. It's one of those things where you don't want to go in with the first pigment you mix most of the time. It's a lot of back and forth until you get what you really want. It's patience, it's accepting that painting is a really exploratory hobby, and that you try something and then you try something else. You try something, you try something else. It's a lot of problem solving, but in a really creative and fun way. Let's go back to more orange. Warm up those purples. Still have a bit of Mars black. There we go. And that's what we've been working for. Beautiful. See? We put in the time, we put in the effort, and eventually we find something we love. Doing soft blends with rotational applications up into the previous cloud so that it all fits together. Now we will get a bit closer. We'll switch back to the larger flat-headed brush. Yet again, we'll mix up a nice orange. This one's pretty much a half and half between the yellows and the reds, at least in terms of final outcome. We're probably using 2, maybe 3 times the amount of Cad yellow to Cad red, just because Cad yellow is not as strong of a pigment. We have to use more of it to get the proper balance of an orange. Then more titanium white, we'll thicken it up. And titanium white is great in these instances because Cad yellow and Cad red are not the most thick pigments, so you have to do a lot of layering. Titanium white, on the other hand, a very thick white, and it just really speeds up that process, gives you something more opaque. So I'm going to apply that to the bottom. You can see looks much more full now in application. We're going to continue working that upwards with a very wet brush. Trying to avoid a streaky aesthetic by just being very soft with the brush, but occasionally I can work in an X-shaped pattern to move pigment around in a more unique way, less structured. So if there are brush strokes, it'll look a bit more wispy, like clouds. There we go. Do a hint of it at the base of this cloud. I like that. I like that a lot. Now, as we take yet another step back, I'm going to switch over to my smaller flat-headed brush. Great for holding a good amount of paint, but also delivering a sharp detail. And with this, I am going to grab a little bit of our sky blue. And because we continuously go back and forth between working on the sky and our clouds, I want to make things a bit more unique again. open up portions of these clouds, and I'm using the corners of this brush to do so. It's not going to get me the softest blends like a filbert, but it is going to be able to cut in a unique way and give me really delicate intentional markings. So yet again, I start with kind of a larger opening, which I soften through taps in various directions. And then I go back into the middle area with a bonus tap. And that's just to interject a little bit more light. So we can work these in. Sections of open sky. Then we go to the edges and we just blend those out. Initially it'll look really stark and a little bit awkward because we only have a little bit of it and it's quite dramatic in relation to everything else that we have, but eventually it looks nice and natural. See that? The more we do, the better it looks, and we can also bring portions of it down from the sky into our clouds. Having larger ones will also help with that. We don't want too many, but just enough. And it's just another one of those things you keep working until you love. You can soften with the filbert brush if you feel like the edges are too hard, but I think I'm doing okay with this one. Now, yet again, we'll get a little bit closer. We'll mix more of our nice yellowish orange for the base of our painting. This is our third or fourth time applying it here because again it is quite thin. I'm doing a lot of layering back and forth. We'll start bringing that up. We're going to want a soft blend, but we also want our transition to be a bit more red. So we'll just make the mix a little bit more red. And right now you can see this is a very bright pigment, it's strong. I want a softer transition from one color to the next, so I'm going to do a bit of an X-shaped swishing. And this is just going to bring it up in a much more soft way than moving horizontally continuously. Just going back and forth until I find the perfect balance here. Okay, so we have a good number of layers on our sky now. It is dry, and I want it dry because I want to go in with some thicker yellows, kind of titanium whites, things in that orange range that are innately thin, and you probably want to layer on top of a dry backing if you want it nice and thick, because we can use a lot of pigment, we don't worry about it blending. And with that, I am actually going to grab a Naples yellow for the first time. I'm going to mix that with my Cad red. I'm using the larger flat-headed brush, using a little bit of the Cad yellow deep hue as well. And this will render a nice, thick, warm, but less saturated orange. These two, quite saturated together. These three, less saturated, but still a nice orange. And the Naples yellow thickens the pigment fairly dramatically, which is kind of perfect. With that, we're going to brighten up this base. Going to make that nice and warm, nice and bright. We'll build it up with a couple more layers and make it even more luminous, but for now that's good. And then we're going to use this to cut some lines that can connect to that bottom piece but don't have to. And with it, I'm going in, and as you can see, I'm doing some taps, but I'm doing slight rotations with the brush. And the idea here is that we're building the bottom of clouds which are catching light and it's going to wrap up the top of them. We can do a slight blend upwards if you feel like you need to make it a little bit softer. And then we'll bring it even up to this area where you can kind of still see a little bit of brush stroke. And now it looks like that warm light progressively works its way up the sky and into a really nice piece. Said, let's double down on our warmth and brightness. We'll grab additional titanium white, additional Naples yellow. We'll work those together. We'll apply that to the base. Yet again, even brighter than before. We'll grab that yet again. We'll work it into the bases of our newly established clouds, at least the bottom portions. I'm using the sharp part of the filbert. You could also use the smaller flat-headed brush, but I like this because it allows me to blend upwards with the sides of the corners if I want to. So it's just a bit more versatile. Have to love the filberts. And then I'll do another layer and just slowly build this up to be a bit brighter. Let's get you a bit closer though. Okay, so we're back to it. Yet again, going brighter, going a little bit more yellow. So more titanium white, more cad yellow, more Naples yellow. And that's a bright color. That works really well. Trying to extend it more to the center, that way it doesn't just exist on the right hand side. The painting as a whole will feel more balanced now. We do a soft blend up. We can let it dissipate and get a little bit darker towards the right hand side. That way again the eye does focus more in that central spot. But this definitely needs more layering. There we go. We can also swap that brush out for our liner brush. We'll make that nice and damp. And now we'll really be able to accomplish some details within these clouds. And this can be very sharp markings, so you need to be careful about where you're applying it, how much you're applying it. But when you want those definitive strokes, this is a great way to go in and get it done. I'm letting the pigments become less dramatic as we move up higher and higher, because realistically as we move farther and farther away from the sun, it'll just get softer and softer in terms of value. The hue also changes to be a bit cooler as we approach the blue of the sky. But I like that so far. You can see we're going back and we're doing this a couple of times. It's one of those things where it does require some build-up. There we go. Make the brush nice and damp. We'll just do a soft blend upwards. That way the bottom area is sharp, the light is catching it, and then it's wrapping its way up. And then we have this kind of shelf effect where it gets to be that darker purple at the top, which is quite nice. And then I can go in the little spots in between and do little bonus clouds. The more small lines we have at the back, the more it looks like there's a lot of clouds in the distance. And then we progressively open up space as we move higher and higher. Now, yet again, we're actually going to go back to our filbert. We'll grab our titanium white, Naples yellow, cad yellow, titanium white. We're going to try to mix the brightest pigment we have thus far. Place that right there in the center. Let it progressively get more orange and dark as we move that way. Let it progressively get more orange and dark as we move up. But That's great. That's what we're really looking for. Switching back to the liner. We can go to the past, less bright oranges, and we can create transitions. And I think we might even do a glow. But for that, I do need this to dry to a point. So I think we'll take a 3-minute break. I'll probably just get some water. Important to stay hydrated, stay healthy as we do our paintings. And then when we come back, I'll show you how we do that. Now we're going to get nice and close, move into this little area back here. It'll be our first part of land, and it'll be in the distance, so it's going to have a lot of those same warmer hues attached to it, just because it'll have a lot of those background lighting elements. So we're actually going to begin here, as you can see, by mixing up a good amount of our initial orange. Then we're going to make it a bit more desaturated with Mars Black and Titanium White. And we're doing this because the area back here would have innately been green. But thanks to that sunset, we get something a lot more interesting. So it's one of those things where we don't always paint with the natural colors of a subject. In a lot of cases, they're augmented dramatically by the surrounding area. And I'm going to now switch over to the liner brush. We'll grab more of that pigment, and we're going to just tap on the tops of little protruding trees. And I'll do a bit of a blend down. You can see that there's slight inconsistencies in this mix. There are areas that are a little bit darker, areas that are a little bit lighter. I actually love that. It's going to make this spot as a whole look much more unique towards the end. And we want that variance. We want there to be shadow, we want there to be light, we want there to be a wider array of options. This is only layer number 1. We're going to do multiple. We are working with acrylics, but I think this is a good first layer and a good idea of the final colors of highlights that we want. Doing little taps just to create more inconsistencies. Take a step back. Now, taking a step back, admittedly, I do think that while it looked great up close, this color and this color together, from a distance, I think it notably just needs to be darker, more akin to what we have through here. So we are going to remix a little bit of our purple. We'll grab that nice blue, our cad red, make it more red dominant. Grab our titanium white, and we'll just give this a go. Again, I think a big part of these videos isn't just showing you what to do correctly, but also how to course correct and how to just maneuver through paintings in a way that gets you to the results you really want, right? So we'll give that a try. Immediately I think, you know what, that's darker than what we have in the clouds. It's probably just a little bit too dark. More titanium white. And maybe we do a little bit of yellow as well. Grabbing the cad yellow deep hue. Let's put that in, and oh, I love that. Okay. We may have found our color. And then we can add highlights to this that are maybe more akin to what we have at the top. But I think this is much more in line with what we should have for the backing place. Also, we probably want more highlight towards the left-hand side than the right-hand side. So if I'm leaving any of this orange, it's probably towards the center. And then we'll switch back over to the liner. You can see I left a little bit of that top open. We'll grab our orange. I'll apply that at the top here. I'll do so with a bit of a tap and a drag, and I'll move some of that darker pigment up a little bit, but I'll move the lighter pigment down as well to the point where we have this almost speckled variance. It's not too much of one color or the other. There we go. Oh, I really like that. It's one of those things where like we can just keep going back and forth until we get exactly what we want. There are definitely elements of the orange that I like. There are elements of the purple that I like. I don't think I want too much of either of them in their pre-applied state. I think that looks quite good. Now we need this to dry, but we're going to move a little bit closer on the foreground and work on this section of land next. This is going to be a bit more of a high contrast than this. It's also going to interject green for the first time. And as we progressively get closer to us, we're going to increase the contrast, we're going to increase the saturation, we're going to move to more innate coloring, and we're doing that because we're moving away from the light in the background, which is creating less and less of a transfer as we move to the foreground. So let's go here and start working on our base layer. Now, for my base layer here, I really want something that is cohesive with the blue in the sky. So I used a phthalo blue. I'm going to use a phthalo green, which I have right here on my palette. Again, it's a bit of a cooler hue, so we can interject some warmth towards the highlights. But I'm going to work on the base layer here. It's going to be not the brightest, it's not going to be the darkest value. It's kind of in the middle, something we can add shadow to, but also highlight. So we'll grab our phthalo green for the first time. We'll grab some Mars black, some titanium white. We'll gray this down because we really don't want anything too saturated yet. We get more of that green saturation as we move towards the foreground. But I like this a lot, and I think I like it enough to give it a shot. So we'll move in here. Immediately I can tell I like it. It's a little bit too dark. It's a little bit too saturated. We'll interject some titanium white. That will both brighten it and desaturate it. There we go. And this will be good for a base layer. Now we'll cut around and over a little bit of our background. We'll move over here to the right. You can see I'm rotating my brush because we have a nice sharp edge we can use to interject these little protruding pieces. And now we'll press more of the body of the brush into the canvas. It'll expand the bristles and we'll get a larger application. Just like so. Nice and easy again. And then I'm going to make sure we have a nice thick coat because, again, it's acrylics and we do need that for layering's sake. From there, I think I'm going to put the brush down. I'll pick up the liner yet again. And we'll just create some more unique protrusions for our trees. The trees are closer to the point where we will actually see some of the detail work. So let's interject some detail work. And this just shows that we have a wide range of bushes and trees in the background. Makes it a bit more interesting. And I might have this wrap up here just to create a variance of height. It also creates a bit of a vignette around the sky. It frames it. It's not in the reference photo, but I think that it could be beneficial. An idea I just had, wasn't in the initial sketch. But again, if you do want help with all of the sketching and getting everything just where it should be, the traceable is up over on Patreon. There you can also get an image of all of the materials and paints and all of that I'm using. You can watch this ad-free. You can get my ebook, which includes Acrylics for Beginners, up there. And you can also get access to our Facebook group where everybody shares their renditions of these pieces. Great place to get inspired. I think what's been getting people really excited as of late, this year again, we did introduce an ad-free version. So you watch it up there, and it's just my way of saying thank you to everybody who does support the channel up on Patreon. I really wouldn't be able to make these lessons and videos if it wasn't for you and your support. So thank you for keeping the lights on. Thank you for making these lessons happen. I appreciate it greatly, and I hope you're having fun with this. That said, I do need to let that dry a little bit, and then we're going to come back in with a new brush. Now from here, we'll take a step back and we'll grab some Mars Black, make that mixture a bit darker, and I think a lot of it actually dried on my palette while I was waiting for that to dry. So I'll remix what we were doing before. Again, titanium white is needed to desaturate, but we do want it to be darker, so we're doubling down on the Mars Black in the mix. Just make sure you are still using a bit of that titanium white. We'll spread it fairly wide on the palette, and we'll switch to a brand new brush, that being the fan brush. And this is great because it can make 50 different markings, all incredibly small at the same time in a almost randomized application. It's really unique. It's great for rendering detail in foliage, and right now we're painting the shadows, the insides that aren't receiving light. So I'm going to go in with a tapping motion, and I'm going to rotate my brush in the air, never on the canvas, otherwise we create streaks and we want little impressions. That said, probably difficult to see from afar. It's a little detail, so I'll get you a bit closer and we'll look at it together. So again, we're going in, we're doing a tap, we're rotating the brush, we're doing a tap, we're rotating the brush. The goal is to never really render lines, and it's easy to do. I'll show you. If we just press the brush in, we get a line. So the idea is that we're pressing about a third of the brush in, and we're rotating the brush so that we disrupt any more dominant lines that would show up. And through overlap and through this repetition, this movement, we're able to ensure that we get something that's a bit less line dominant. You will get them occasionally, that is okay, but here I'm doing it fairly randomized so that I don't accidentally do the same patterns over and over again. That's also important. And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to double down on the bottom area, because this area is getting less light than the top. So it'll have more shadows as a whole. And then those taps dissipate as you move upwards and we get more light. So already we have this light that looks like it's working its way over. Now, this brush right here, if we make it wet, I'll show you what happens. It forks. So now we make larger markings, and we make 5 or 6 of them. This is great for rendering foliage more in the foreground, larger foliage. Not great for when you want something really sharp. So I don't want to now grab pigment with this and then apply it. I want to dry this brush fully, and when you dry it fully, the bristles will re-expand and separate, and you get something like that again, and then we can go back in. That said, before we add highlights, I do want to let this dry just a little bit, because when I apply this, I don't want the wet pigment mixing with the dark pigment and rendering a muddy kind of mid-value. I want something brighter and distinct and intentional. So we're going to let that dry. We're going to clean this well, we're going to dry it well, and then we're going to be back for the next step. Okay, so we've given it a little bit of time to dry. We're going to go back to our larger flat-headed brush because it's better at mixing. And then we'll grate a highlight for our phthalo green. With that, I'll start with the phthalo green. I'll add some titanium white. It will naturally brighten it, but we do want to desaturate it. This is just something that wouldn't fit within the current palette of our painting. So we'll grab some Mars Black, not too much, but enough. And then we also want to make this a little bit warmer because it is getting that light. We can do so by grabbing some of our Naples yellow, just like so. We could also interject a hint of our Cad yellow, deep hue. And I think the combination of these two with the phthalo green is really gorgeous. That said, still might be a little bit too bright if we look at it in contrast with what we have. So I'm going to throw in just a little bit more Mars Black into that mix. The final pigment here isn't bright, isn't saturated, but it is bright and saturated compared to what we have on the canvas. So now we'll take our dry fan brush. We'll load that up, we'll get a little bit closer, and we'll start applying. Now this area is quite fun because we really get to see things pop and start coming together. Here I'm adding highlight to the tops and the areas that will definitively receive that light. I'm trying to use these incredibly sharp but sometimes difficult to maneuver bristles around the tops. At this point I'm only applying 3 or 4 markings at a time, not dozens, and then I'll start to move down, and this is where we can create separation in our foliage, in our tree. Now these highlights should dissipate as we work our way down because we are getting farther and farther away from the light, but here you can see against the backdrop of the darker area, it really stands out in a beautiful way. We can get it lost, we can become a little bit ambiguous. If we have areas that become too bright or too full, that's also all right, because it's not difficult to go back in and make it darker again, should we need to. And I'm just trying to create a lot of good variance between our trees. So you can see how this one comes down. This one is kind of this horizontal piece, similar to that. This one moves down, but it's in 2 different steps. This one comes down just a little bit and then it's horizontal, but then maybe it's both more horizontal and more like steps. And if we don't like it, that's okay. We just go over it again. And then I'll do little splashes of highlight for randomly protruding branches throughout. We can switch on over to the liner brush, grab that dark pigment, and just do a little intentional sculpting of the foliage, like so. We can also go in with this brush, grab a little bit more yellow, a little bit more Naples yellow, create a much brighter variant, and just tap that towards the tops of the foliage that are closest to the light. And I'm doing that with the liner brush. It's making a larger impression than the fan, but it's giving me slightly more control, which is valuable with such a prominent pigment. This is something I'm just keeping towards the top. You can see how we just layer it. Step by step, we start with the mid value, we move to the shadows, the darker value, and then we go to the brighter value, and then we go to the brighter value, and then we go to the brighter value, and we just build, 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 while we occasionally go back and adjust darker areas that could just use a little more. Okay, and now while we let that dry, we're going to move over here to the left-hand side, and we're going to tackle trees that are a bit closer to us. And every time we get closer to us, remember, we can use less of the backing colors, but we can also make it a heavier contrast. So we're going to have more Mars Black, and we're going to render the darker, slightly more saturated version of the mid to dark value that we had over here. Again, I'm starting with the mid value, but because it's closer, it's farther away from the light, it is going to be darker, and then we're just going to use an even darker dark value for it. So I'm going to start by just blocking this in. I'm going to avoid the edges initially while I get the excess paint off of my brush, like so. And then I'll approach the edge with more of a rotated tap, We're going to have a lot up here. Remember, if you have brush strokes or taps in this section, it's not a bad thing. It's going to add a good level of texture, make it more unique. You can see as we move higher and higher, we create this interesting arch. It frames the highlights and the sun really well. It just creates this great vignette. You might want to clean your brush and go in with a slightly more wet application when doing this if you just want it to be hyper sharp, but I like the impressions of the brush up there. I'm also now going to switch to the liner. Make sure that's nice and damp. And then I'm going to paint on individual little clusters of foliage and branch protrusions. Similar to what we did back here, but we can make them bigger and more unique through this section. That said, this is a heavily detailed application and you probably want to be a little bit closer, so I will get you right there. I think it's already off to a pretty great start here. Something fun we can do is create a larger cluster that almost doesn't connect except for a couple little pieces, and that's going to make a unique look, something different from over here, where it's all kind of connected but protruding in the same way. And we're looking to build that variance, instigate that diversity, make it more unique, because that's what'll make it look realistic. Now we'll grab a bit more. Head up, same idea. There we go. Really like this so far. That section, I think it feels arguably the best almost. Let's do a little bit through here. Just a little bit. We don't want to cover all of our light, but we also want to cover enough that it makes sense. I think when I started painting, I would have been afraid to put any paint over this because I would have really liked the light and the sunset and I wouldn't want to cover it or, you know, hinder a portion of that view. But realistically, in nature, you would have foliage that does cover it, and it's important to incorporate that. So we are doing so. We're not doing too much, but we are doing so. And then of course, it does come down here. Have a little bit of that orange peeking through. That's a nice touch. And you can see it's a lot of pitter patters with my brush. The occasional drag, but I really don't want to press the brush too hard into the canvas because I don't want to expand the bristles and have a very large marking. I want it all to be fairly small. Said I think we're quite close to achieving that. And in the reference photo, I can see this almost goes to the halfway point. I'm going to bring it out a little bit farther into the right-hand side just because I think that it will feel more natural compositionally. You can see some brush strokes in here. Not a problem, not a bad thing. Again, I actually really like that just because it will add texture in the following layer. Now from here, we're going to mirror essentially our process of past with Mars Black, our Phthalo green, a little bit of titanium white, but not much. We're rendering our darkest mixture yet. We're switching on over to a fan brush. It's dry, so I'm just going to fluff it out. We'll grab some of that pigment and we'll go in with that same tapped texture you know and love. And of course, here's a nice and up close view of us applying it. You notice that I do get a bit quicker here than I was previously, and that's because A, we just have more surface area for me to be playful with, and I don't have to be as intentional with my mark making, but also just because we're warmed up. We had some practice, And it's actually great that typically with painting, with acrylics, you work from the background to the foreground because you get to warm up in the background in the areas that are innately less detailed, where people look less. And then as you move towards the foreground, the area where you want the viewer's eye, at that point, you're good. You have your motor skills firing, you're creating in a very efficient way that you like. And it's definitely coming together. Now, once that's fully dry to the touch, we are going back to the larger flat-headed brush, and we are creating our first highlight in this set of trees. Again, titanium white, phthalo. These were our highlights from before, so I'm mixing right beside them so I can see essentially what we're working with and what we need to consider. We want something a little bit more saturated than them because, again, we're moving to the foreground. We still want it to be warmer to a point, so I'm using both the Naples yellow and the Cad yellow. And already I think we're finding a really nice hue. I think we could go a bit darker. There we go. So we're moving away from the light. It's getting less warm, but it still has warmth in it. It's getting slightly more saturated, but it's not hyper saturated. And I think this is just what we need. So back to the fan brush. Going to carefully apply this towards the tops of my trees. Just little taps here and there. And then we can start working them inside to a point. We're definitely going to want multiple trees in this space. It's not just one. So we're going to break it up and down like we did over there. I think coming down off of this one is a good start. Remember that we're going to have less and less highlight as we move towards the bottom because there will just be less light as we have more of the subject blocking itself. Again, a really nice cool green in contrast with the warmer backing. We can do another tree over here. I had it on the sketch, and again, you can go back to the traceable if you like, start the video. But I think I have a good idea of where they're going to be, so I'm going to freehand it through this process to a point. And then we have less highlights over here because, again, we're getting farther away from the light. This is casting a shadow on this. But we still need some protrusions. We still need some highlight. And we'll just bring it all together. Remember, if you accidentally do too much and you're not fully happy with it, feel like it just got bright as a whole, we can always go back to the darker mixes and re-interject those. Right now I'm pretty close, so I can't tell, honestly, if I like it or not. That's one of those things where when you're up close to a painting, you kind of have a distorted view of what it actually looks like. You hyper-focus on the details, but you don't know what it looks like in a room. You don't know what it looks like from that distance or holistically. So I'm going to take a couple of steps back after I get the majority of this pigment off of the brush and just make sure that I like the direction it's going in. And stepping back, happy to say I do. So that was a lot easier than it is sometimes. I'll switch on over to the liner brush, pick up a bit more pigment, and we'll intentionally add in a couple more where we struggle to with the fan. So getting closer, one thing I noticed again, or rather stepping back, was that this area kind of just moves down on a slant. And I want it to be a lot more interesting than that. So I think I'm going to make this get higher, and then I think I'm going to make it get lower again as it stretches this way. And we have this secondary piece that, like, maybe this comes down and maybe this connects to a point. So now where it's three-dimensional, that it moves back and then down again, rather than just having one line and then two lines. Now they connect. And then we can tap that into there. Now we have this transition point behind the back and the foreground. We're also going to take this opportunity to just really make sure that we have all of the darker areas that touch the light be braced by a little bit of green first, because all of the edges there will be highlighted to a point. And I'm not really trying to make these markings bigger. I want them to be nice and detailed, nice and subtle. So I'm going around the edges of the dark and I'm just kind of repainting those areas with a green. So I'm not making it bigger. I'm not extending these applications much. I'm replacing darker pigment with a lighter pigment. Then we can also, again, go back into areas like this and add detail, build fullness. You can see the canvas, the easel as a whole is kind of doing this little shake right now. It's fun. Doing a little dance. There we go. Really love this spot. I think the atmosphere is coming together. I think the most important part of a painting is that you deliver a feeling, and I think we're definitely getting there with this one. Now we'll take a step back and we'll render a slightly warmer, slightly brighter version of that. Not by much at all, but it is the same previous mix with slightly more of our cad yellow, slightly more of our titanium white, slightly more of our Naples yellow. And we'll take this with our liner brush and we'll also apply it around the outskirts of our previous markings, just giving us one more layer of highlighted depth. But this is also great because we can use it to essentially work our way down some of the more distinct, larger trees on the top and create these more definitive peaks and separations in an area that might have otherwise looked a little bit visually monotonous. You don't want to do too much of this, and I'm going to stop before I really get to the left hand side there, but I will do little bits that are facing the light through here. And again, if I ever accidentally do too much, we just go in with the darker mixture again and we fix that up. So now as we get closer and we really look at it, you can see that this is a bit more stark. The darks in here from the darks that we have there. The highlights here are brighter than the ones that we have here. And we want it to look like this is in the foreground, and slowly as we move back here, it gets less saturated, it gets a little bit warmer, it gets less contrast heavy. And then on the other side, maybe it picks up again. Maybe this is part of the foreground in the way that this is, and it just kind of cradles this backing area, which progressively has more depth. So I think I like that a lot. And now we're going to start moving into this section right down here, because that is where we're going to have a lot of the actual pond and really the next step. So as we move down, we are switching back to the larger flat-headed brush. We are yet again mixing a nice mid-value green. So Mars Black, Phthalo Green, Titanium White, and this time we are going to get a little bit warmer again. We have this opening. Light's going to be able to move through here and illuminate this in a way that it can't over here because of that. So with this, we're going to grab some of our cad yellow, a little bit of our Naples yellow. We have this beautiful mid-value for our green, and this is going to be long grass, it's going to be bulrushes, it's going to be a lot of your typical pond variety. I'm just going to cut a nice line with occasional divots just for the sake of making it a bit more natural looking. We'll move it slightly into the foreground. We'll continue to move it into the foreground, and by having it kind of get lost behind this bush and then get lost behind this, it creates this staggering effect, which is really nice for creating depth. We can also have it kind of get lost up here, so it looks like they're trailing out into that space. And then we'll cut a nice sharp line towards the bottom. We want this to be nice and thick, but again, we can show brush strokes. And then we're also going to move it into the foreground, just through there. And then I'm going to do all of the finalized applications through a vertical marking, because we're going to see the sides of all of this grass. It's quite tall. The majority of what we see is the sides. So we want to make sure that if any of these brush strokes are left in the end, they are alluding to the fact that there is a vertical movement within the subject. And we can make the area that's slightly closer to us slightly darker, so a little bit more Mars black right through here. And we can also make the edge over here a little bit darker as well, because again, this is going to cast a pretty dramatic shadow as a whole. So I'm just going to do a couple of applications. Again, leave in any brush strokes, not a big deal at all. If anything, it's a blessing. So from there, we are going to render a darker version of our green. This one will be more saturated because we're closer. It will be less warm. Still will use a little bit of that titanium white, but not a lot. We'll make it quite wide on the palette, and we'll switch on over to our fan brush. From there, we'll grab that pigment. We're going to create a lot of vertical lines working their way up to show that there is separation between our grass, but we're only doing it, as you can see, partially upwards, where this is going to be the tops of our grass and this is going to be the edge which we see. And then we're going to make larger ones over here, smaller ones over here. They're smaller over here because these are just not as tall visually because they're in the distance. Perspective is making them look smaller than what we have in the foreground. But that's also pretty easy. It's just an extended stroke. We can also take this and do little occasional taps in the back just to build in a little bit of darker texture. We're going to use lighter pigments for the most part, but especially around the bases of our trees where there will be more shadows, this is nice, it's appropriate, it'll look good. Because remember, if the light's coming this way, it is going to create a shadow from this. So we'll just do a little bit of a tap, and it opens up and gets brighter in that midsection. Could do a little bit of it over here, but not much. There we go. Now, if we want real detail and intentionality, we do switch to that liner brush yet again. We head on in and we do individual markings. These will be a little bit larger than that of the fan brush, so we have to be careful. But as long as our brush is damp, we apply very little pressure, we should have a good amount of control here. It's also worth noting that I'm trying to make the base of these shadows a little bit more full, so I'll go back in and do those a second time. And it's a bit sporadic, a bit random, but the idea is that there are more shadows towards the base of the grass than there are towards the top, because the grass will cast a shadow on itself. It's pretty intuitive. but it does make a difference. And we'll do 1 or 2 over here as well. Okay, and now we get to have some real fun with the highlights. We have the shadows in, we have the mid values. We'll build the highlight with a bit of our green. We'll grab an equal mixture of our Cad yellow, grab about 1/3 of that in our Naples yellow, hint of our Mars black, hint of titanium white, and then we'll just go back in with our yellows until we get something that's a little bit brighter. Throw in a touch of our Cad red, and this is just going to warm it up. I want the light to be coming through here, warming this section of the grass. So we'll have a hint of orange in the green. Not much. We're just doing a less is more approach with the red as we slowly interject it with the Cad yellow, the Naples yellow, but it's definitely a warmer variant. Then we'll switch on over to our clean fan brush. We'll go to the back. We'll start tapping in tops of our grass. And this is just using next to no pressure. And here we actually can render the lines that we were trying to avoid earlier by just continuously working horizontally. I'll get you a bit closer for it though, because it is nice detail work to watch. So here, again, going in, just doing the tops of the grass. So I'm not going over the vertical markings. And as I move towards the left-hand side, I just let it dissipate until we have almost nothing left. And then we have this natural transition from pigment and highlight and color to next to nothing. I'll also press a little bit harder with my brush as we get closer to the foreground, because we will just see a more dramatic marking. We can do hints of it back here, but not much. And then towards the top over here, we're actually going to do a stroke. Just like that. Work that down. Build this nice depth. We can do a hint of that working down through the tops of these vertical areas, but it's just hints. We're not bringing it down all the way. There we go. Nice and subtle, nice and easy. Now we're going to head back to our mix, make an even brighter, even warmer variant, slightly more Cad red, an abundance of additional Naples yellow. Mix that up. Switching over to the clean fan brush, and I always mention clean because I do like to clean it between different colors. And we'll just run this along the back as well. We already have these pre-established highlights we can work from. And again, we have a lot more light seeping through this section, so we want to take advantage of that. Have it dissipate towards the left, dissipate towards the right, but still have hints. We can do minor markings that work their way down. And we will need it partially for the tops of these. You can see they're getting really sharp and nice. Standing out in a fairly unique way. We can also take this, tap it onto the tops of these trees in the background, that way it's all nice and cohesive. Again, this will be receiving that similar warm light, so it only makes sense that it too would share these values and hues. Have to be careful that it doesn't become monotonous, but I think we're doing just great. We do a hint over here. And if you want, you can work it into the edge of this and this with the liner. I might do a little bit, but I don't want to do a lot. Don't want to become too dramatic. But I do want it to fit together. Just hints of this warmer light. Oh, that's where we found the magic. Love that. Again, not too much. Easy to overdo, but there's definitely magic in this application right here. This is bringing it together in a beautiful way. I feel like these are the steps in painting we paint for. The feeling right now. Watching it amalgamate and oh, I love it. Actually, while we're here, why don't we also use the liner brush, grab a little bit of that pigment, and then we'll head into this grass right here. Render some intentional, much larger blades, which cut through the darker base. At first it'll look a little awkward, but the more you do, the more it'll make sense. There we go. Welcome to the evening. We've been painting for quite some time. It just got dark, but I really don't want to put the brush down, so I think we're going to continue here. I'm switching to a smaller flat-headed brush. Again, great for sharp details, but also moving around a good amount of paint. And we're going to extend part of this downwards so that we have different layers of this taller grass that's inset into the pond area. And for that, I'm going to mix up some of our green, Mars Black, titanium white. It's predominantly a much darker Mars Black mix, but we do have the hints of green and other pigment. And I think I'm going to bring this down right about here. So I'll just make that darker base, like so. And then I'll do vertical lines protruding from that bottom area. That way it looks cohesive with the rest of the painting. And you can see how this protrudes down into the white of the canvas. Not something to worry about, something we're going to double down on later once we have water. And we're going to probably paint over this and make it a bit more of a horizontal marking, but this should show through to a point. It might look like portions of this elongated grass underwater, and that can be a nice effect. We might get it, we might not, but it sets us up for success. And now, I think what we'll do, we'll grab the liner brush, we'll get a little bit closer, we'll make sure that brush is nice and damp. We'll grab some of our Cad yellow, our Naples yellow, hint of titanium white, and our green. We'll mix that up into a highlight akin to what we had before in these highlights. And we'll do a really nice golden top to some of the grass here closer to the edge that'll catch light from the top. But we'll also take this and we'll put a little bit on the side here. Because realistically, this will protrude. This will catch a little bit of light. We will see these strands catch highlight. And it's subtle, but I think it's a really nice addition. There we go. And also had hints of this mix into the back. That way the color itself feels cohesive in the space. Oh yeah, I really like that. You can see it's in the trees, it's in the grass, it's in the tall grass. And now it all feels like it flows together. So once we have that section fairly complete, we're going to jump back to the larger flat-headed brush and we'll have some fun blocking in this quite large area down here with a reflection. Things to know before we get started. Typically a reflection is a little bit darker than that which it is reflecting. We can do it with a crystal clear glassy look, or we can do it with quite a flow. I'm going to do a little bit of an in-between, which means we'll be mirroring the top, but I'll be doing lots of little horizontal strokes to bleed pigments and areas into one another. Shows a little bit of movement, but not too much. Adds a little bit of detail, but not too much. And I think with this, it's one of those things where it's a flat plane, the water, right? So in theory, we could paint all of it at once. However, I'm going to layer this similarly to how I did the top, in that I do the background first and then I slowly work forward with the subject so that we can do things like layer this over this rather than having to paint this around this. Saves time, makes it look nice and clean, and I think it'll be a good technique for this base area. I am again going in with the larger flat-headed brush. I am looking to mix a similar pigment to what we have here for the sunset. So that's a Cad yellow, it's a Naples yellow, it's a titanium white, it's a hint of Cad red, but just a hint, taking off the excess. And we could also do a hint of Mars black, but I think I'm going to avoid that for the first layer. I'm also not going to connect this highlight to the very top because we are going to have the reflection of the grass coming down into this section. So we're only going to bring it to about there, and then I'll bring it down to the grass on the right hand side. I'll have it cut through here, and we'll have this grass layering on top of it as well as the reflection of this, but we're not really going to get the reflection of that back there because it's too far away to cast a reflection, where this is close enough to get a little bit of it. So we'll proceed with a Cad red in our mix. We'll really double down on making this a nice orange, but at this point, again, we do want the reflection to be a little bit darker, so I will grab a hint of Mars black, titanium white, we'll desaturate it. We'll come in right under and we'll start the blending process. There we go. Nice and simple. From there, we move into our purples. So we'll grab some of this, and we'll start mixing. So we'll grab some of that blue, Cad red, titanium white, and we want to gray this out. So Mars black as well. A bit more. I'm slowly adding Mars black and titanium white, until we get something fairly neutral. Typically, I like to keep past mixes somewhere on my palette, so if I remix to them, I can find it easily and I can color match easily. This has had a very large palette, this painting, so I haven't been able to isolate those and keep them on the palette in the way that I normally do, but I think this is relatively close. We could test it by tapping it in the sky, but I think I'm just going to go for a preliminary application, like so. Again, darker than the top portion, but I do want a transitional color, so I'll add some additional titanium white. We'll add in a little bit of yellow, a little bit more red. We'll warm up this purple. Put it right between our orange and our darker variant of the purple. By the way, this will have a reflection of the grass, but I'm painting it in so that we can do the reflection over it, and it'll just be a little bit more interesting. Now, if we want, we can go back to our orange, and we can start blending this appropriately. Just like so. Honestly, already looking quite nice. Might do a little bit more. We can always rebuild those highlights back upwards. And I think I'm going to do that because we need just more layers. We're working with acrylics. And again, acrylics do require extensive layering. So we're just committing to that. It's also important to remember that every time we apply a layer, we're probably getting a little bit better at it, right? We learn as we paint. That's how we grow, that's how we get better. So now we'll just extend that down. Already love the colors that we have. And I think we'll move into a bit more of a slightly patchy purple that gets a bit darker, but then transitions into the colors of the sky, the open sky, the nice blue there. So let's mix a good amount of that purple. Let's apply it right underneath. I am painting over my lily pads. I am painting over the grass. I am painting over portions of the reflection, and I'm okay with that. These are all things that we can go back in and repaint. We will. We'll just resketch them in. Again, you can use the traceable, make it really easy. There we go. And then as we move downwards, the right-hand side is going to have a purple reflection. The left-hand side is going to open up into sky, but I think I'll move you a little bit farther back so you can get a good view of all of it. So right now, admittedly, the gradient's looking a little bit basic, but that's okay. It's how it's meant to look at this stage in the process, and we're going to make it look a whole lot better. So we have this mapped like that. We have the start of our warmth. It's just a base layer, so we're going to do a lot more, but so far I'm quite happy. Now we're mixing our sky blue, so a lot of titanium white, a little bit of our blue, Mars black to desaturate. I still have some of that blue on the palette, as you can see, but because it's the reflection, I do want it to be a little bit darker. So more Mars black than before. Still a bright pigment. Again, not worrying about the sketch, and I'm also initially not bringing it into the purple. I'm leaving that border, and then once I'm here, I'm making a slightly brighter variant to match the slightly brighter top. I'll apply that right through there. Again, added titanium white. Nice and simple. And then with this, we start blending into our purples. And over here, we'll take off that excess pigment. Might grab a little bit more of the actual purple. And we'll just work in that X-ish shaped pattern that got us the initial blends and applications that we liked. Also, the beauty of doing reflections like this is that we're remixing pigments, we're reapplying similar applications, and in all of that process, we're reestablishing that we've learned how to do these applications, this type of painting, and therefore in the future when we want to do a similar subject, we know that we're ready. It wasn't a one-time thing, we've solidified it in our heads, we've done it a couple of times, and we'll probably retain it a little bit better. So benefits to painting in such a way. That said, I like it so far. I think we're getting there. Now we'll switch on over, as we did initially, to the filbert. We'll grab some of our nice purple and we'll reestablish some of those more definitive clouds and markings. Again, I don't want a perfect glassy reflection, but I want one that's reminiscent of that which we have. And we're not just going with the first color we mix, we're really mixing. Okay, we'll do a little test. Make sure this is the right hue. We have some interesting moving clouds on this side. Kind of work this way, and then we have one that kind of protrudes upwards, spaces out in a couple of different directions. Again, this is easier when it's wet on wet, but it's doable wet on dry if we just use more water on our brush. There we go. And it's pretty nice and easy from here. Again, we've had that practice. We've established that we can do it, so we're going into it with confidence. Making these a bit softer. We have multiple layers of clouds up here, remember? Some of them are more opaque, some of them are semi-transparent, and we're making sure that we accommodate for both. And then we'll also do some nice soft wispy clouds that mirror the top of the painting. Give it a bit of a vignette by painting the edge darker. We have a little opening in our cloud over there that we can hint at. There we go. Good reflection. Let's get a bit closer here and work on the highlights within the sky. Though before that, let's clean our brushes and our water because we're going back to yellows and we don't want to use a brush with a lot of blue and yellow on it. Otherwise this will turn into a muddy green. So let's get a little bit cleaned up and jump back into it. Okay, so we're back, we're up close, and we have clean brushes. I'm going to grab our filbert, some titanium white, Naples yellow, cad yellow, hint of cad red, Mix up a nice whitish orange. I'm not grabbing any Mars Black for this. I do a little test up here. I can see that it's nice and close. So now, from there, we can just instigate some of these horizontal markings from the sky into a reflection of the water. And we're going to do it not perfectly, but in a similar style, because again, I'm not mirroring it. You could paint it exactly as it was if that's the aesthetic you want. I think the water will just be a little bit more interesting if we get slightly playful. So I'm going in now with the liner brush, doubling down on the areas that I like and adding slightly more fine detail. Then I'll grab some extra titanium white, work that into my mixture with a little bit of Naples yellow. We're moving farther and farther away from the cadmiums through this process. And now we have this quite bright mix, akin to what we have up there. A little bit darker still, but still very bright. And I'll add that to the sharper bottom of the reflected clouds, which in the reflection is of course the top of the line. There we go. Then we'll have some reflections on the other side. I'm going to make them a bit more subtle, but I do like that. Maybe we'll do a couple more. It's one of those things where I'm trying to add very few at a time, just to not overdo it. And we just slowly build up. Also, this will look a lot better once we clean up this top edge and we start to instigate a bit more of our reflections of foliage. It's the contrast of the darker values that will make this look the way it's meant to. We're also painting lily pads on it. So if there's an area you do and you don't really love it, just know that later on there is an easy fix through cover up. And I'll show you how to do that. I feel like we really had fun extending it. It's working well. We might do a little bit of a wash to just soften this with some further oranges, but for now, I think I'm pretty happy with the general look. Apologies if my hand is occasionally in the way here. It's one of those things where I'm painting on an angle and it is at night and I've set up the studio lights, so kind of have to be somewhat mindful of that. But hopefully it still looks good. Hopefully you still feel like you're learning and you're having fun. You're finding some inspiration, figuring out how you are going to work on your rendition, or if you're working on it as you paint, as you watch. Hope it's going beautifully. Hope you're having a lot of fun. Remember, it's acrylics, so it'll take some time to layer and it won't look amazing initially, and that's okay. You trust the process, you trust yourself, and you keep on going. And eventually you render something you really love. And that's what we're doing here today. So far, really like that. Okay, and now as we step back, we are going to endeavor into the reflections of these, and that requires a very dark green. So I'm starting with the actual green. Then I'm doubling down with about an equal mixture of our Mars black, hint of our titanium white, and honestly, I don't think we really need much else. So we're going to head into this. We're going to look at our reflections through here. We're going to look at our reflections there. I'm going to begin essentially on the horizon of this backing grass, and I'm just going to drag that pigment down softly, like so. So now we have it meeting the other portion of our reflection, and then we're going to go up here, and we have grass to there, so we'll just do the same thing. But then we have this larger piece of foliage, and with that I'm going in with a little bit of a twist and a turn, similar to the original application, trying to somewhat mirror that which we've previously rendered, but again, doesn't have to be perfect. And then we'll apply a lot more pressure in the body of the subject, and through vertical markings we'll combine it with the grass that we had up here, losing some of the detail, but we'll still probably see some of it through that section. Then we'll head over here as well, and we'll work on the reflection for our grass. Nice and easy. Using the corner of the brush to work it inside larger portions of the grass, little blades. And then I can use that sharp edge to render individual little markings, like so. Yeah, not too tricky at this point. You can also use a liner brush to clean it up. Now that this has had some time to dry, I'm going to head back over here briefly, do a second layer. So far, so good. Let's get a bit closer and work on some details in this reflection. Now we'll get quite a bit closer. We'll switch on over to our smaller flat-headed brush, and we'll start remixing a nice, really dark green for reinstigating some of our grass. So I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to do a little tap and a drag along the edges, and I just want to drag grass on top of our reflection. That way it looks like the grass is inside on top of this body of water, and the body of water is moving through it to a point. So this is just a lot of really subtle drags, applying very little pressure with my brush. We'll grab a bit more. We can head over here, background, do the same. We can even instigate a little bit of that in our reflection for the more prominent pieces of grass. Just like that. Not with all of them, but with a couple. And it'll just help create this idea of that which we're rendering. Grab a bit of water. Might mirror some of what we have over here to a point. Don't want to do too much, but again, just enough to remind the viewer that this is a reflection. I soften that, a little bit of finger painting. Now I think something else we can do is we can go in and we can really build on the reflections that we did with the larger flat-headed brush. because while I think we have a lot of great shapes in here, we can get a bit more intentional. Switching to the liner, grabbing more of that dark pigment that we used, and we'll start re-instigating our reflections. Initially, I'm doing it through a very similar application style and technique to what we did previously on the top. So it's a bit of a tap, it's leaving openings. Though we will change this in a little bit, not dramatically, but to a point. And as you can see, it's starting to feel much more complete in the reflection. Still have lily pads to do, still have movement to apply, but we're definitely getting there. Now here, I think I'm going to do really small vertical lines. And honestly, the larger flat-headed brush, just through a stroke down, will probably do this to a point. So it's already somewhat done. This is more of a refinement. There we go. I do think it helped. It's not a dramatic change, but I do think it builds and adds in a nice way. Now let's also grab a little bit of our highlight for our yellow. And if you don't have it anymore, we can just remix it quickly. And I think I'm going to do a little soft line in the back here to show that the water is breaking between the two. Incredibly subtle. And then we can do that through here. It's not a bright highlight, it's not a thick line. We want something that just feels unbelievably soft. And then here, because the grass comes down at a lot of different lengths, we're just going to essentially mirror it in little spots and sections. It's not a straight line, like so. Also doing tapped, it's not always just a line, sometimes a dot can be powerful. And I made it a bit brighter, closer to the edge, and it dissipates as we move this way, kind of following the same rules as our general shadows and whatnot. We can also now go back to that darker pigment. You don't have to do this, but if you want to, again, because I'm not doing like a proper mirror, I'm going to drag some portions of this out to show that there's movement in the water. So it's just minor movements like that. You don't have to do it, but I think I like the look. There we go. Don't want to do too many, especially not in the beginning. Again, it's a less is more application style. Looks good though. Looks good. Hope you're having fun with this one. Definitely been in a mood lately to paint reflections and ponds and sunsets and gardens and greenery. I think the summer is in full effect in my mind, and I'm just very much enjoying the process. I hope you are too. There we go. Now, as we step back yet again, I think what I'm going to do is render a darker green. So I'm using the liner brush here. I wouldn't normally recommend this for blending because it's just not a large brush, doesn't allow you to do a lot, but I don't need a lot of paint. So I'm going to mix up a dark, but not too dark green, just using the Mars Black, Titanium White, and our green. And I'm going to tap in some minor highlights into our reflection. That way we just get a bit more depth. But I'm also going to make some of the lines simply horizontal, especially as we move into the middle area, which is definitely more negative space. And this is a really easy way of A, integrating more detail, but B, showing slight movement in the water. Incredibly subtle. You can barely see it, but that's definitely the point. Meant to be subtle. Meant to be not completely noticeable. And then we can also do that over here on this side. Also, if it does become hyper noticeable, it might conflict a little bit with the lily pads we intend to add. So do be careful of that. And again, opt for subtlety to the best of your ability. There we go. Now from here, we are going to move into the water, and we're not working on the reflection at this point. We're working on our lily pads for the first time. I'm going to do so with quite a bit of our Titanium White, our Phthalo Green, a little bit of our Mars Black because we do need to desaturate it. Double down on the Titanium White. Now we have this nice slightly grayed version of the phthalo. And I do want to make it a little bit warmer, so we'll interject our Naples yellow. I think that does a great job of continuing to mute it, but also give it that slight sunset flare. If we want, we can also try interjecting just a little bit of our Cad Yellow Deep Hue. That'll re-interject some saturation while also warming it. And then I'm going to switch over to my liner brush, make sure it's nice and damp. That way we have a sharp tip to work with. And we're going to begin adding these into the background. Now I know we have some right through here, and again, there is a drawing of this at the beginning of the video and in the traceable, but I'm going to go in with these subtle little taps, doing a slight drag to the left-hand side. I'm using my pinky finger to brace my hand on the edge of the canvas, trying to make sure that these are different sizes by a little bit, and that we have that consistent ongoing diversity. Following the reference photos movements for the most part right now, however, that will change as we continue, because it's one of those things where I want to take from the reference photo the ideas that I really like, the ideas that I wouldn't naturally think about, but I also want to interject my own, improve the composition a little bit, spread out colors to a greater degree. It's one of those things where photos can teach us so much about a subject that we wouldn't naturally think about ourselves, but at the same time, we don't want it to handcuff us to either color palettes or compositions, which simply could be improved. So it's one of those things where we make a lot of decisions about what do we keep, what do we not. Looks like there are quite a few out here. I'm also initially making these quite small, and we can make them larger as we progress if we want to. Also, as we get closer to us, they will get bigger and bigger. We have some over on this side. These are ovals, by the way. They are done through elongated strokes, but when they get a little bit bigger, I do tend to do a little bit of a rounding towards the top and the bottom, a little bit of a sharpening on the edges, just like so. And again, we want these to really stretch. Love the way they look as we start to move out into the water. In the distance, they're going to be quite small, if not kind of combining visually into these amalgamated areas and applications. Grab a little bit more. Again, as we get closer to us, these markings and lily pads get bigger and bigger. I like that a lot. They become just dots in the distance, but they stand out well in the silhouette of the grass. This little reflection back here, great for them. And the green's a little bit different from that of the grass itself, which is also great because it means these get to stand out from that to an extent. Doesn't become monotonous palette-wise. There we go. Let's get you a little bit closer. There we go. So yet again, damp brush, clean pigment. Lots of little tap and drags, even in the background. Though in the background we are amalgamating them, so we're seeing clusters of them rather than individual ones for the most part. There are going to be one-off little individual ones, and that'll be the smallest tap possible. We'll also ride them kind of along the edge to a point, but then we do need to build it out. Just like that. I'll also go over a number of them a couple of times because we are using a watery mixture and it is making it semi-transparent. Now yet again, we'll take another step back, and I think I'm fairly happy with the areas that we have so far. We'll probably go back and add some here and there, but I don't want to overdo it. And I'm trying to move around a lot so that I do keep that open mind before kind of overcommitting. So what we're going to do is we're going to start moving down in the painting, which means these are going to get a bit larger. We will lose them visually to a point as we move over the reflection of the sky because we're dealing with two of our brighter values in the painting, but that is okay. I am going to show you how we make those stand out again, but it's also all right if we lose some of them because that would happen in nature. There are points where we just can no longer see the subject, and that's a-okay. Trying to space these out in a unique way, but also kind of create this pathway which leads towards the foreground. That said, I think we're kind of close to that point where if I continued, we'd be moving out of the view of the camera. I don't want to do that. So I think I'll just do a couple here. We'll move the camera back down. Now, as we do move closer to us in the painting, we do move farther away from the light, and therefore our subject should get a little bit darker. With that, I am interjecting a hint of Mars Black, and my pigment is starting to dry on the palette, so I'm just going to mix more, but a little bit darker this time. This will also help it show up against the lighter blue sky reflection. And that isn't the tip that I was going to give you on how to make things stand out. We'll still talk about that in a little bit. But for now, this is great. Switching on over to the liner, grabbing some of this nice new pigment. And then as we move here, we can make another set of applications. There we go. Again, they just get bigger and bigger the closer we get to us. And they are nice ovals. So if I don't, on the first attempt, make the edges rounded but also pointed, I'm going to go back and I'm going to do it again. And already these are looking a lot better. See that? Stand out well. Now we'll continue working our way to the left. Also, just because they're in our foreground doesn't mean they need to be big. We can play with the scale because some lily pads will just be bigger than others, and that's natural. I might do less than what I see in the reference, just because I don't want to overcomplicate it, but we will do a good number of them. It's also good to change your greens here and there, as we just did, because it'll make it a little bit more unique. The eye won't be able to fully understand what's happening on a first glance, which is kind of nice just for keeping your viewer of the piece engaged. I always find it fun as an artist to look at a painting and try to guess the palette, and when people take the time to diversify things like that, I always really appreciate it. I think it's a relatively easy way of really building. Don't get me wrong, I like a clean, simple palette. I do, I use them here and there. But I also like something that's a bit more playful. These refractions will look really nice when the lily pad goes over two subjects. So here it's going over the reflection of the grass and the reflection of the sunset. Here the reflection of the trees, but then it'll also overlap with the sunset. Down here we're overlapping ones with the clouds, but also the open sky. Just like so. And again, we are being very mindful. Like that. Okay, now once we have our desired number of lily pads, we're going to switch on over to the larger flat-headed brush. We're going to take just a hint of additional Mars Black, work that into our mixture so we have something slightly darker than that which we had. We'll switch back to the liner brush, and then for all of the lily pads in the foreground, we're going to actually give them a little bit of a reflection, a little bit of a lip on the bottom portion of the oval. And this is going to make them look nice and three-dimensional. It's going to help them stand out against the lighter blue of the water. And it's just a really easy way of adding a nice effect to all of these little details. We can also have it trail off behind some of the lily pads if we feel like there's a movement in the water. Easy way to make it look like it's running just a little bit. And we do have those changes already instilled with the horizontal lines which carry the shadows out into the highlight. So we have implied some amount of movement in the water. That said, let me get you closer. I know this is a very detailed process and you probably want to see it up close. Now, here we have a really good example of what it can look like. Again, grabbing a nice damp brush. I'll work that under these. You can see it under some of them, not all of them. And that's okay. It's one of those things where it will aid a couple of these, not all of them. That diversity will help the painting as a whole. And we can also build lighter versions of our green, which are a bit warmer, so a bit more Naples yellow in the mix. And we can apply this around the top rims of some of these. And that's going to make them look more three-dimensional as well. And the rim of it is going to be around the top, the front, but also around the back. And I'm typically just choosing one to highlight. But again, it's an easy way of adding dimension to what was previously just a little soft stroke. And this will also really help them stand out in the darker areas. So those shadows help it stand out in the light, and these highlights help it stand out in the dark. Both of them together make the painting what it is. Help it render its real potential. So right now we're kind of going back and forth between the highlights and the shadows. I think it'll work really well in this corner. The shadows didn't show up too dramatically, so there's room for extra application, detail, structure, without it feeling like it's too much. I really like this. It's also not the final step. One thing I've really grown to love about ponds in these settings is just there's so much detail and life you can add freely. And we're going to do so. Right now I'm just kind of jumping around, lily pad to lily pad. Wonderful. We can also use this highlight to craft individual little ones in the background should we want to. You don't have to, but it can be a nice look. Now, taking a step back, I think it's starting to look really nice. I'm now able to kind of go back into the areas where we started to establish some, but we didn't establish all of them because we were hesitant, because we wanted to see what the piece as a whole would look like. And now that we have a better idea of it holistically, we can go back in and do all of these fun little additions. I think this area is one where we could do more, but we are going to have a lot of that grass right through there, so I'm actually going to take it easy in that section. I will, however, do a couple just hints of them in this corner. We have it really feel like it's trailing in, leading the eye, and we are working on that larger leading line through this section because it is kind of this triangular shape that brings us into here, and then this little section can bring us up there or up there. This can lead us this way, and we're just trying to create these patterns and these directions with our lily pad that moves the eye towards the center of the painting and really the sunset as a whole. So far, so good. Bridging these areas fairly intentionally. We'll also, again, continue to make those highlights as we go. That way we can add dimension and depth to the darker lily pads, which we are currently exploring. And this green's a little bit different than the green that we used last time, because last time we used a lot of Naples yellow, but I actually really like that variance. And just doing these little taps occasionally are nice. They're not big. They're just there to kind of accent the larger piece as a whole. Add a little bit of application value diversity. Because these are almost just little taps, they're also a variance in size. Let's just work in a space that we haven't really done. And that's fun to play with. There we go. Okay, let's get a little bit closer. So now from here, we're going to get quite a bit closer, grab that larger flat-headed brush, and we'll mix up a nice mid to dark green, fairly saturated. Also going to grab a little bit of our cad yellow just to interject a hint of additional warmth, make the green a little more unique. Then we'll switch back over to our nice little liner. And if you remember, at the start of this video, we had tall grass right through here, which we're now going to interject. I'm going to start with a very soft touch. And then I apply a little bit more pressure as we work our way down. That's going to expand the blade. And then I start to move a little bit more quickly as we continue. That way we get a bit of a randomization. Also, a lot of these blades are going to be pointing this way and bending inwards. That's purposeful so that we have leading lines that push the eye back in towards the painting. If I don't get a sharp top, I'll go back into the blade of grass a second time, and I'll just create a sharp top on top of the previous top. So here you can see it's a bit round, a bit dull. We'll grab more pigment. I'll go a little bit wider. And there we go. Now it's nice and sharp. And you can go back and fine tune really all of these if you want to. But I like that. It's a good start. We're going to need to change our color fairly soon because we do want some of these to be a little bit brighter, a little bit darker. You can see that I'm leaving a good amount of space between our clusters of them right now, and I'm really just doing that so that we have that leeway to add more of different values. You can also mix up various greens at the same time for the sake of speeding up this process, bouncing between them. Let's take a step back. Okay, so stepping back, I really like the movements. I think it pushes it forward. I think it diversifies this area in a way that I wanted. However, I think they need to be taller and I think they need to be darker. So we're grabbing additional Mars Black. We'll remix some of that nice green in there. Hint of titanium white. A little bit of our cad yellow. We'll switch on over yet again to our liner brush. And I painted these about the same height as they are on the reference photo. We're going to change that. We're going to go quite a bit taller. And already I like it more. This is a quick, easy fix. I also think we needed a lot more grass. And now we have it. If you think about it, we had quite a bit of tall grass right through here, and that isn't that far away from us. So the grass over here should be relatively tall as well, just so that it works within the pre-existing continuity of our perspective. You can see that I've accidentally now multiple times made that not sharp enough. So I'm going to go back in. We have these two blades right together. We have another one that's cutting through. It's important that the grass does frequently overlap because that shows that there's depth within it. There we go. Easy. Really love these movements. Now let's head over to the right hand side just a little bit. I'm going to do a piece of grass that moves in the other direction occasionally, just for the sake of making it not look too artificial or monotonous. There we go. Ooh, okay, love that. Definitely getting somewhere. I think it's framing the painting nicely as well because now we have a good amount of vignetting happening towards this bottom corner. We also have this area over here, so it kind of wraps around in a nice way. Grab a bit more of that darker mix, and I'll continue to build this edge. We can also do some over here if we want. I'm mildly apprehensive, but I'll do just a couple. There we go. We can do a little test in the air, see if we like it. I don't think I want that. So I'll just go back and I'll clean up this. Now let's get a bit closer yet again. Now we can take the same pigment with the same brush and we can interject little pieces of grass that are just naturally in the water as well. And then we can make a very watery version of it. And we can paint in slight reflections of said pieces of grass. So the reflection is much softer, but it's so noticeable. And it's just a great little detail. Will add a lot to the painting. There we go. We can also have little sticks and protrusions. That's always interesting. We can use this pigment to create additional little lily pads in the highlighted backgrounds, areas that didn't previously stand out in a way that we like, and that just gives us an opportunity to further diversify, which is fun. Just like that. If you end up doing too much or something you don't like, remember it's as easy as just going back with another hue, fixing it up. There we go. I think this actually adds a lot. Tiny little details, but meaningful ones. And these dark protrusions work great in the background because we have so much light, so much contrast. We can also make lighter ones, should we want, with our Naples yellow, cad yellow, titanium white, a little bit of our green, a little bit of our Mars black. And we can add a highlight to some of their edges if we want. Just areas that catch light. Don't have to. But I think it's a nice detail. And it also means we can do some that really stand out in the darker area. Want to go back to the darker mix. Saw a spot. I just want to heighten a little bit. I like these pieces of grass, but they were a little too soft. Value-wise, we just bump that up. Now, at this point, we're going to take a step back. We're going to render a fairly dark green, still using a hint of titanium white and Naples yellow. We'll clean our liner brush quite well, and we'll go in with some little taps along the water. These are smaller than the lily pads, and they're just little rocks or leaves. Nothing specific, but an added detail, an added texture, an added rhythm, potentially leading line or cluster. That just adds to the realism of the piece. Because this water won't be perfectly clean or clear, it'll have little things in it, and it's important that we remember to incorporate those. Because it's a lot of bonus aesthetics, subjects that we'd be leaving on the table otherwise. In the distance, they're smaller. In the foreground, they might be relatively big, but it is something you probably want to paint from a little bit of a distance. And, you know, as we step back, I think it's fair to say that I'm very, very happy with it. I think the painting as a whole really came together with the bonus pieces of grass here on the water. And Now yet again with the just little pieces of debris and nature in the water as well. So with that, I think this is the conclusion. Might be one of those situations where I put the painting up on the wall and, 2-3 days later I have another idea and I go back to it. But for now, I think I'm very happy. And on that note, I would like to say a big thank you to all of you for being here today, for spending this time, for painting along. I hope you feel relaxed. I hope you feel inspired. I hope that you go out and render something that you really love. I think this was probably my favorite piece this year, not only to paint, but just also the final aesthetic of it. Hope you have similar feelings. Also, as per usual, big thank you to everybody up over on Patreon for making these lessons happen. You support the channel directly, and I couldn't do it without you. So thank you for contributing and keeping these lessons coming. If you're new to the channel and you're unaware, Patreon again is where you can get the traceable for this, the material photo, the ad-free version, all of my ebooks, access to our exclusive Facebook group. We have over 100 bonus lessons up there, some of which on much larger canvas. We're currently working on a series. It's a 24 by 24 inch canvas, and that's been a really fun scene. We're about to work on the water, which is a bit more complex than this, but we're going to do it over a lot longer period of time. We're going to take it step by step, and we're going to have a lot of fun. So if you're interested in any of that, go check it out. There's a link in the video description. There you can also find a link to my brush set. And all of these painting lessons that I do on the channel, at least as of, I believe, 2021, have been done with this brush set. So you pick it up once and then you can do all of the lessons, all of the new lessons, and not have to worry about not having a certain brush. Link to that in the description as well. But with that, I am going to finally put the brush down. I have a really hard time doing that when I paint. It's one of those things where you just enjoy the process and you don't want to stop. But I think I don't want to overwork it. So for here today, I'm very happy. Again, I hope you enjoyed. Hope you had a great time. I will see you soon with another 2 painting lessons. So make sure you subscribe if you haven't. And again, above all, as always, have fun and stay creative.